So, good evening, everyone. Welcome back to Parabellum. Yes, I'm starting a bit early, then we'll settle everything together when I'm late, in the next live streams. The truth is that I have a lot of things to do tomorrow, so it's better to start early, also because this time there are quite a few things to talk about. If you remember 10 days ago, 2 weeks ago, we made a short where we said that the conflict in the Middle East will obviously have repercussions on the one in Ukraine. Not to sound prophetic, it was pretty obvious if you follow these things. Unfortunately, what we said in the short is coming true. And what were we talking about in the short? We were talking about the fact that Ukraine will become a competitor for anti-air resources, since the Gulf monarchies also need ammunition and anti-air systems. And so this came out, which I'm showing you now. Then we'll have to see if it actually goes through or not. However, basically, the Pentagon is considering redirecting weapons intended for Ukraine to the Middle East. It's a very complicated matter. I'm trying to make it simpler. Let's say there are basically some things that have priority that are included. NATO funds, it's not just American funds, they're involved too, but they're also NATO funds in general. Okay. They are almost certainly the weapons that could be diverted from Ukraine, which include interceptor missiles for air defense ordered under the prioritized Ukraine program list, under which other NATO member states purchase weapons produced in the United States for the Ukrainian armed forces. That is the one where we put in the money, American weapons were bought, and they were given to Ukraine, for example, the Patriot missiles. Well, suddenly, a Pentagon spokesperson said that the Department of Defense will do it. That is, it will use what was promised with the funds provided by the Europeans, and instead it will be used in the Middle East. The NATO official did not say whether the alliance is aware of this possible diversion of U.S. equipment or whether it is concerned about the prospect. The alliance is aware of this possible diversion of U.S. equipment or if it is concerned about the prospect. In an email, the official said that countries continue to contribute to Pearl. This system and equipment is continuously flowing into Ukraine. However, since the beginning of the US attack on Iran, there has been this fear that Washington might instead burn through munitions for themselves and for their involvement in Iran. So, as we can see, this is not good news for the Ukrainians. This, of course, is the reason why we've seen Zelensky being very active in trying to get involved. Speaking of the original article, it comes from the Washington Post, which was the first to publish this, and says it spoke to 3 inside sources who, let's say, did not want to be identified. But this is quite interesting to keep an eye on. Anyway, also considering what has happened in the last few days, one of the biggest drone attacks carried out by the Russians happened just a couple of days ago. So the tension continues to rise in Ukraine, just like the Russian strategic campaign, and the use of drones, which has increased over the past year. We have gone basically in 2025 from 300 drones to almost 800 or 900. And probably during 2026, the waves will exceed 1,000. Just to give you an idea, we're still talking about drones. We did a short about how the Ukrainians caused some problems for Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania by flying their drones through. Most likely, forget about the propaganda videos because there are a lot of Ukrainian videos showing a big arrow going from Ukraine all the way to Luga and other places they hit. In reality, they didn't take that route. That's just a simplification made for propaganda purposes. In reality, the Ukrainians didn't start from here, from Kyiv. They reached Ust-Luga and Primorsk, passing through Belarus and Russia. In reality, we know that they went around the borders of Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and it seems they even crossed into Finland, at least into Finnish waters, because they basically took this route here to strike. And in doing so, that's why I tell you it's propaganda when you see those images with the big arrow going from Ukraine all the way to Ust. Eluge, because in doing so, they hit a factory chimney. I can't remember if it was in Lithuania or Estonia. So they did do something along the way because they hit near St. Petersburg, Ust-Luga, and other places. Because 40% of Russian oil exports pass through there, especially through these two terminals, Primorsk and Luga. But there are also fields there, dynastic production docks, and this is interesting. You see, this is a video made by the Ukrainians, and notice the video is immediately cut. You see them take off, and it looks like they're going to Belarus, but they actually took a different route. What did they hit? They hit some tanks, and also, it seems, some pressure pumps that are used for oil. We know this because there are satellite images, but also videos, including Russian-made before and after footage, so we can also make an assessment of the damage. In this case, if we look specifically at what was hit, we will basically notice smoke, flames, and so on. Now bring up the audio too, okay? Thanks. They were hit with, in some areas, especially port areas regarding Primorsk and Luga. And after, this was during the night, and then we saw the damage. Yes. But you can clearly see the damage done. And above all, we have the before and after satellite images where you can see the comparison here. They basically hit 5 tanks that, by the way, are still burning because the NASA firm's images show us that everything is still affected. Then, little by little, the news starts to come in, and you also notice other things. They didn't just hit Ust-Luga and Primorsk, but they also hit a place where a ship was being built. What kind of ship? Anyway, these are other images. These are from Ust-Luga. They're from today. As you can see, there's still black smoke everywhere, so it means everything is still on fire. Everything has been hit. In the midst of what's happening between Iran, Israel, and the United States, among other things, today may be an attack. An American refinery was hit. It's not clear if it was an accident, but it seems really suspicious because it sounds really strange that an accident happened in America. What a coincidence, an important refinery. At the same time as what's happening in the Middle East, also judging by the images. But later, when I have more time, I'll show them to some experts, let's say in explosives, and you can see that the damage seems to be from the inside. To give you an idea, as you can see, it's at least curious that even the Americans have this kind of accident sabotage. We don't know, but especially at a time like this, it's a bit strange. That at the Valero refinery in Port Arthur, a large refining plant that produced 415,000 barrels a day. Suddenly, there's an internal explosion. You can see that everything inside is pushed outward, which is typical of an explosion, of a deflagration. It's a bit strange, that it happens right at a moment like this. So going back to Luga, as you can see, we have satellite images from before and after, and we know that these are 2 important hubs for the Russians, especially at a time like this when they were probably trying to take advantage of the rising oil prices to make money. Suddenly, the Ukrainians, of course, imposed the sanctions in a way These are videos made by the Russians themselves because it's their territory. So as you can see, it's not brushwood. There you go, as someone would say. So as we can see, there was quite a bit of damage. The interesting thing is that besides what happened around here, as I was telling you, there was a ship under construction. This ship was the FSB Project 23,550, an Arctic patrol ship, which actually could also launch caliber missiles, have a helicopter, and so on. At first, it was thought that only the refineries had been hit, because these were the reports most often seen in satellite imagery. But actually, then this also came out. This view here, the cameras from the dry dock of the port were hacked by the Ukrainians. Only the Ukrainians could have had this kind of view of the ship. We also know what kind of damage they inflicted on the actual ship, because later more images came out, and so we are able to verify. The ship is listing. This was the type of ship, as you can see, and these are the damages. It was a ship worth about 220 to 250 million. Something like that. Here you can clearly see the ship listing to the side. Here you can see it even better. We don't know about the damage to the sides. Anyway, there are about 2 ships involved, because I think that even here, the one it leaned on still caused some damage. So as we can see, there is some pretty interesting news on both sides. On the other hand, the Ukrainians are using a new method to operate drones, that is, a remotely operated method. Basically, the new way of controlling drones is no longer with the operator 20 kilometers away, etc. Very close by. Lately, they are probably developing this attack here. In fact, most likely this attack, which is 900 kilometers from the borders of Ukraine. Most likely it was done with this system. Here, basically, with this system, which is obviously linked to satellite communications, most likely remotely, comfortably from a hotel, they managed to basically control these drones. By the way, now this thing gets interesting, because if both sides start adopting this kind of method for using drones even from 100 kilometers away, instead of having operators at 10 or 20 kilometer well, it will be hard to lose operators. So there will be, the drones will dominate on both sides. It's true that the Ukrainians have an advantage because they have Starlink. The Russians don't have this kind of coverage. We'll get to why in a moment. I made the cover with the bear with the blindfold over its eyes for a couple of reasons we've already discussed in the past weeks. You all know they've been banned from accessing Starlink, and you know very well that Russia is blocking Telegram. So they lost 2 forms of communication at the same time. It's not like the Ukrainians just stood by and watched. If we look at this big analysis by Tossini, especially regarding the attacks and what kind of attacks the Ukrainians carried out deep into enemy territory, but above all, where they carried them out. And it's related to another piece of news that I'll give you in a moment. You can tell that something's up. What do I mean? Something's up in the sense that most likely the Ukrainians have been for some time now, judging by the images and geolocations, slowly destroying the Russians' anti-aircraft systems, radars, and many other things like that. And this makes you think, especially in connection with certain activities they're carrying out elsewhere, it makes us think they're getting ready. And we've seen it. Their aircraft have played a very passive role in recent months, even the F-16s, the Mirage 2000S, and so on. They've always been used simply to intercept drones and things like that. so they weren't used much in situations that exposed them to risk. Well, all of this is interesting because it allowed the pilots to be useful and, so to speak, lighten the load of the Ukrainian air defense system. But above all, they gained a lot of experience because they carried out a lot of missions safely, away from anti-aircraft and everything else. And in my opinion, this allowed them to gain a certain amount of experience. Of course, they still can't challenge the power of the Russian Air Force yet, but they can definitely start to do something. If they have created areas, let's say, where there are gaps that they created themselves, not gaps that just happened by chance. And now I'll show you this thing here, which is very interesting because it gives us an idea of what they did. These are all geolocations of destroyed Russian anti-aircraft and radar systems, especially, as you can see, in the area of Crimea and basically in the corridor of Zaporizhzhia and Donetsk. If I don't read the whole article to you, I'll try to summarize it so at least you get the idea. What matters to us is this part here. That is, how many S-300 and S-400 systems did the Russians have before the war? A total of 908. Current remaining, 586. Net loss, 322, a change of 30%. 45% note that Moscow before the war, at least the Moscow Oblast, had 191. Now it has 260. The south of the country, which before the war had 100, now has 130. But if you notice, in the central area, they basically had to select what they want to defend. Pay attention, the attack that the Ukrainians carried out recently is right in this area. Here, where there was a drop from 290 to 92. The same goes for the Baltic Fleet, almost 50% less, and the eastern and central areas, these too have been sacrificed. Keep in mind that in the central area, the Russian Central District, they had 132, now they have 32. Here they had 139, and now they have 38. This means that given the reduction, they had to choose what to defend. What's interesting is to see, especially what the Ukrainians have targeted. They targeted Buk systems, so short-range defense, Tor systems, Panzer systems, Tungus, Castrela, radars, many S-400 radars. You can have a beautiful S-400 battery, but if there's no radar, they're just pieces of metal. S-300 radar, S-400 and other launchers. As you can see, it's a well-considered choice of targets to strike. And there are all the related videos that you can check out. I'll give you the link later. What's interesting about everything that's happening is mainly this: the destruction of Russian radar and electronic warfare systems. I assure you, these are very expensive systems, complicated to replace, and they require personnel. Yes, Leningrad would be St. Petersburg, go figure. So it's interesting to see that the number of destroyed radars is very high. This means they're trying to blind the Russians, especially in the area of Crimea and the Zaporizhzhia corridor. Here, there's also the breakdown by type: long-range air defense, that is long-range anti-aircraft defenses, medium-range and early warning or targeting radar systems. Because all of this is quite interesting. Here you can find all the other data, you can see the satellite images. Because if you connect this also to the attack on the Cyberborosho factory, which coincidentally produced parts specifically for this kind of systems, so microelectronics and so on, and if we connect all this especially to the recent news of unusual activity by the Ukrainian Air Force, it makes us think that most likely they will want to try to do something with this Air Force. This is the idea. This is the basic idea. They have at least created the conditions in some areas to maybe be able to do something. Ukrainian forces are conducting a very high number of training missions, especially in the Ternopil Oblast. So obviously they have also received other planes, and as it happens, there are also a lot of videos filmed by people showing the activities of these planes. By the way, one of them was this, but you're a fucking asshole. Here you can see a Ukrainian F-16 going to shoot down a drone. This is the Russian Baron drone that you can hear passing by. The Ukrainian F-16. This kind of activity, especially at low altitude, is giving Ukrainian pilots experience. They don't have much, but if they create areas, at least where there are gaps in coverage, maybe we'll see a certain type of activity, even offensive, in addition to the passive one we've seen so far. So we'll keep an eye on this. Let's say that connecting all this data tells us something. As I told you, the reason for the cover is all these things put together. They're blinding them in terms of radar and air defenses. The Russians are blinding themselves with Telegram, and then they were excluded from Starlink. The Russians were left watching. Obviously not. I consulted Marco Bussi, and he told me that honestly, considering the number of satellites they're launching, they can't even remotely do what the Ukrainians are doing. With Starlink, just to give you an idea, recently the Russians have recently launched 16 low-orbit satellites, and they're basically trying to create their own mini Starlink. Also, because they don't need it all over the globe, they only need it in a certain area. But that's still really too few to have real coverage. So as you can see, they're trying to solve the problem they had after being excluded from Starlink. The other one, which they created themselves, meaning censorship, is still on Telegram. This information gap, along with Ukrainian activities, suggests that something might happen. Above all, we saw this in January, but especially in February, which was the worst month for Russian advances since 2024. Basically, this means it had a big effect beyond the cold and so on, which slowed everyone down a bit. However, in terms of advances, February was the worst month for the Russians since the beginning of 2024. So basically, it's interesting to see if it's one of many contributing factors to consider. How much of a factor is Starlink, the Telegram factor, or Ukrainian activity? They don't just destroy radars and anti-aircraft systems, they also very often destroy individual antennas, individual repeaters, and so on. That's why we see a front. It's a rather slow month, so as we can see, the Russians are trying to deal with this situation. 16 are not enough, but it's a start on their part. It's something we need to keep track of to see if it will start to have effects in the long term. Let's also talk a bit about the Russian situation with the Russian network deteriorating. They might notice, they might carry out some attacks because we've given them some guided bombs. Usually they use them in Tetkino to the north of Sumy and so on, dropping them a bit like glide bombs from a few dozen kilometers away. But there was really little activity. We had seen them bomb the bridges during that period, but it was always a hit and run. And they tried to operate in a safe zone anyway. Maybe with what's happening now, they'll try to do something more. Or in any case, they also make things tighter for the Russians, so to speak, in this sense. I'll also take this opportunity to give you a bit of an update about the app we're developing, that is, the app with artificial intelligence. It categorizes the sources and gives you indications if the source is truthful, its reliability, and divides them by type. So whether it's aeronautical information, naval alliances, or things like that, we're working on it. We're in internal beta, actually maybe more of an alpha than a beta. We'll work on a way to try to include the community as well. We've thought of a few things like giving out a certain number of keys, especially to the people who have been active in my Telegram, posting, sharing news, debunking things, and so on. And then during a discussion, I had an idea. I mean, I remembered something, the SETI program. Do you remember it? Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence. There was a little program. Since this stuff is really heavy even for us, it's hard for us to handle more than a certain number of users unless we raise some money or unless we manage to, or at least partially, distribute the load of weight, like SETI home. So what's the idea? We're making a small program that people can install at home, which of course we've put a limit on, so that it doesn't use more than 10 to 15% of your computers and graphics cards resources, and you can help our artificial intelligence classify the sources. So well done. It's a kind of group crowdsourcing, so a certain number of people, especially those who contributed the most on Telegram, they will also be taken as initial feedbackers and also for a manual review. Keep in mind that right now we already have more than 11,000 sources inside the app and we are classifying them. But if we do distributed computing like this with a little program, everyone can help out a lot. GPU or CPU, because we'll try to set it up so it doesn't bother people. Then maybe there are nerds like me who will leave their computer on to help us out. But this will allow us to host more users, because keep in mind that even just going over 5,000, we already have huge costs. Instead, with this system, if the community helps us when you leave the house, you can leave it running for us, not even for a whole day, just a few hours are enough. Something like this, if discussed, I'll say it right away. If you know about these things like LLM or distributed computing and you want to help, email me and I'll put you directly in touch with the technical team. And if they see that you're good and can help, you're welcome. What else? If you go in the description, I put the link both to the app's website where we publish updates, and also if you want to send your application, let's say in this sense, to contribute or help out, also from this point of view. From a technical point of view, I assure you that this thing is really interesting. Because while we were discussing, it occurred to me, wow, but what if we do distributed computing instead of buying a huge server and get help from people? And so I remembered this old thing from SETI, and we basically brought it back up. They worked on it day and night, and it's going to be interesting. In the meantime, thank you. Here you can follow the OSINT Intelligence website. So, as you can see, we will involve you from a technical perspective and in terms of feedback, but above all, if you can help with distributed computing, you will also be part of it. Then there's also a ranking, so there will be a score. For those who come in first, we'll come up with something. Maybe we'll do a live stream with the top 3 contributors. From this point of view, maybe we'll go have dinner with me or something like that. So it will be the first distributed computing and artificial intelligence project in Italy where the community and the content creator together verify the sources both manually with the help of your computers and, of course, by improving the AI's parameters. I don't think there's anyone else in Italy doing something like this, so I'm particularly proud of it. Let's get to what's happening on the ground. A few things are happening, but not everywhere. On the Vovchansk front, as you can see, the arrows go up and down. There have been Russian infiltrations towards Vilcha, and there have been Ukrainian counter-infiltrations. Basically, there hasn't been a big change in the situation, also because there haven't been any reinforcements from either side. North of Kupiavovchansk, the Russians continue to expand that strip of land instead, which is right along the border between Ukraine and Russia. However, even though they've gathered some units in the area, as you can see, a few regiments and even a motorized division, not much is happening. Notice that meanwhile, the Ukrainians quietly and slowly are digging a whole series of trench systems, anti-tank ditches, and so on. Kupiansk. There's not much talk about Kupiansk because not much has really happened there. There are Russian infiltrations from east to west, but in the end, nothing definitive. Honestly, there's little activity on either side, also because, as we'll see, the Russians have moved a lot of units, especially along three main directions, that of Siversk and Lyman, generally the Donetsk area, and of course, Zaporizhia. By taking resources away from the other fronts and thus lowering their attack potential, this gives us a broader view of the situation around Kupiansk. Then the Russians are spreading out. They've reached the bridge in front of the Oskil, but there's still this bottleneck that is increasingly being contested by them. The most interesting part, however, happened in Lyman. A few days ago, there was a Russian mechanized attempt with about 100 vehicles, including BTRs, BTR-80s, and BTR-80As and quads, motorcycles, and everything else. They basically tried two things. One, they hit the dam behind Lyman, which is interesting. Trying to isolate, as you can see, this is called shaping, meaning they're trying to isolate the junction points where the Ukrainians bring in reinforcements. So the connecting road between Lyman and Sloviansk is located to the northwest, the bridge that connected Yampil to the southern area. So as we can see, they're working hard. This map that I recommend to you, at least for this kind of geolocation work, is a map that allows you to see even a single loss. So when someone says, it's not true that the Russians lost this one or that one, now I'll show it to you. I just took a screenshot for you. But if you go there and open it for each individual vehicle, for which I'll also show you videos, you'll see the losses. This means that if you click there, you have the source, you see the map. So if you click here on the dot, you can go and click directly on the source. So there are all the related videos, then there's an edited version. Anyway, the Russian attempt was basically to outflank the Ukrainians in the area of Kaldini, behind Lyman. And in addition, we'll see, they also hit a dam to try to isolate the sector. How did the attack go? Like all mechanized attacks in this war carried out honestly by both sides, this is the real attack. And as you can see, the Ukrainians knew it very well, and so they were waiting for them with drones. The Russians are forced, obviously, by the minefields to follow only certain fairly narrow roads. Why am I telling you this? Because is an attack with 20 vehicles, 30 motorcycles, and a quad bike going to change the course of this war? No, but simply because in recent months we've seen almost no mechanized activity. And many were wondering if there would be a return to this kind of activity. As we can see, it's not really great. It basically leads to nothing. So they have to come up with another method to actually achieve something. This also applies to the other side. It's not as if the Ukrainians take 20 armored vehicles, line them up, and try to charge. They would end up any differently. Unfortunately, drones, as we can see, they don't give any chance. I don't know why they insist on using these tactics when it's obvious that it's counterproductive and demoralizing. I imagine it's the same for everyone who takes part in it. So, as we can see, there's a double pressure, especially in the Siversk sector and in this area. around Lyman. What's interesting to see is that this was the attack, the one we saw in the video, as you can see, northwest of Lyman. And this is the dam that was hit, Dam Bridge, because it's on the road that connects Sloviansk to Lyman. So the Russians tried to isolate Lyman and probably tried to either get behind it or bypass it. The ultimate goal, most likely, is to get behind Sloviansk from another direction. This is footage of the attack, apparently involving glide bombs released by the Russians. I don't know if they're glide bombs or drones, it's not very clear. I don't think the bridge, I think it has been repaired like for the 1,000th time. And as you can see, maybe it's even a makeshift bridge, just to give you an idea. The bridge over the Siversky Donets. Judging by the speed, they seem like maybe they're drones too. Glide bombs are usually faster. There you go. This gives you an idea. These are activities the Russians are carrying out, especially behind Lyman, so the situation isn't the best for the Ukrainians. Elsewhere, the Russians are moving forward little by little, getting closer and trying to infiltrate Lyman. It's a constant pressure that's getting close to the breaking point. The latest Russian incursions, as you can see in the contested area, cover both sides of Lyman. This is the Iga Bridge you saw earlier, and the other attack instead went north of Lyman. Another sector where the Russians are advancing is the Siversk area. In the Siversk sector, they are concentrating some units, and especially recently, they are trying to take control. Especially the road that approaches Kramatorsk. In my opinion, the goal is to take the main road, which would be this one that leads to Kramatorsk. And they are trying in every possible way, especially in these areas. These are the latest locations of Russian infiltrations. Obviously, infiltration is one thing, controlled territory is another. But we notice that they are getting closer. This is the sector where they are probably deploying more units. It's not a very favorable sector for the Ukrainians, since there's a small ditch, a canal, and some defensive systems, but there aren't any large urban areas. Before Sloviansk, Mykolaiivka, Kramatorsk, let's say that what has been holding things up all this time has been Siversk. It's Siversk that has been holding all of this up. I'll also show you some other maps in parallel to give you an idea. The yellow dots are strikes carried out by the Russians in this area. So every time I'll show you the ground maps, then I'll also show you Russian glide bomb and artillery activity. You can clearly see which areas are of greatest interest, where they're trying to open, let's say, a route. These are the geolocations, blue for Ukraine, red for Russia. And so they managed to do it. They managed to recognize it, done. And so they managed to recognize it, done. First time, so they managed to recognize it, done, recognize the first one, and so that's it. So they recognize it, done, managed to do it once. They were done for the first time. They managed to do it, yes, the first time. Yeah. The time for the first time, the one that goes from Kostiantinivka to Druzhikivka. Note that the Russians have long been trying to break through right behind to close it at Kostiantinivka, so the Russians succeeded. They are putting a lot of pressure. There are Russian infiltrations that have already been located even deep inside the city, especially if you look at the southeast area. And now that they have taken Bereztok, where there was this fortified and slightly elevated area, note that now they are using Bereztok as a bridgehead to try to enter, to infiltrate the city from 3 directions. If you remember, recently there were floods. Even here, some dams were hit. Do you remember them? These two water reservoirs were hit by the Russians to flood the area behind Kostiantynivka in order to isolate it. A bit like they did exactly in Lyman in the previous video. Good job, Winter, for remembering it. That's why they attacked the dams there too. Notice that slowly, by pushing, they haven't consolidated anything inside the city yet, but they're starting to infiltrate. Notice the dates and look at the periods, all between November and today, just to give you an idea, but really very little. Most of it is from March, January, March, February. This is also what the Institute for the Study of War tells us. On March 24, they managed to reach Ambire in Linivka, which is an area adjacent to the city, especially in the Pred-Tessin area, which they used to flank Kostiantynivka. These are the latest geolocations of Russian units that have infiltrated, and as you can see, they have infiltrated quite far into the urban area. Obviously, this is a very Russian map. So, as you can see, it doesn't really show any contested areas, but they say they've already taken it, that they're already inside, but in reality, it's a contested area. Let's say they don't make use of the zones. Not using contested areas really isn't ideal. Just because 2 infantrymen appeared doesn't mean anything at all. The best thing, at least what the best mappers have adopted, is obviously this degree of uncertainty when you're not able to certify something. Also because both are using infantry less and less, and both are less and less motivated to try to use it. To occupy areas, you only see a few units operating, whether they're defending or attacking, and only in small groups. And so it's inevitable that the whole front is, let's say, fragile. To give you an idea, there are offensive pushes. There's a widespread no man's land, sometimes even 20 kilometers wide. Not just an idea, because now drones operate like an accordion. They open up more and more, so they cover 20, 30, even 40 kilometers. So the contested, uncertain area where one day 8 Ukrainian units are already being spotted, the next day Russians, and so on. It's increasing more and more. So how do we see it? The situation in Kostiantynivka is in the initial phase, in which the Russians, probably during the first attack, will try to assault it, but they will also try to cut it off from behind. Good, like a catapult. Quote by Macho Capatonda. Let's move on to the area of Pokrovsk and Kresin. As for Pokrovsk, as you know, they completed the capture of the city quite a while ago and are pushing towards Kresin. And lately they've managed to consolidate their hold on the city, at least most of it. As you can see, Pokrovsk is now firmly under Russian control, same with Mirnograd, part of Rodinske, but above all, now they've managed to get into Kresin. If you remember in the previous live, Kresin was under a massive bombardment of glide bombs. Keep in mind that most of the buildings are small houses. It was basically flattened. Recently, you can also see Russian units sneaking behind the Ukrainians in Belitske. So, as you can see, this salient beyond Pokrovsk, Kresin, Rodinske, and Belitske isn't exactly the best place to live, is it? For the Ukrainian units in the area, they should probably redeploy around Dobropilia, which used to be the command center of the area. For the Ukrainians, these are the latest geolocations. As for the Russians, around here, as you can see, they've practically taken all of Kresin, but it becomes more complicated for them to advance further after this. Because, as you can see, there are these bodies of water, many roads and fields with very little terrain to use. So, as we can see, there is some activity, and it's interesting to note that most of the activity is still low. I want to show you something interesting from a statistical point of view about what we've seen in the last 3 or 4 months of war. And that is the fact that Look at the colors. So the darker the color, the more units there were of that type on a certain front. As it shifts toward white, there are more units in that sector. Okay, like white is March 2026. Beige is more or less between September and January, September 2025 and January 2026. If you notice, you can see it from the taller white bars. Most of the Russian units have been moved to the Kramatorsk sectors, so the whole area of Siversk and Donetsk and Zaporizhia. These are the main sectors. Kupiansk was until around October or November of last year, so we see a concentration of resources, especially in Donetsk. These are the Russian brigades, these are the Russian divisions. The overall picture is turning out more or less like what we were saying at the beginning of the live stream. As for air defenses, they had 900 at the beginning of the war, and now they're down to fewer than 300, so they've started allocating fewer of them in some sectors. Here, too, there's a rationalization of forces, a concentration as far as certain areas are concerned. So we know from the bombings, from the attempts with mechanized troops, and from these concentrations, that's certainly the point on which the 3 points where the Russians will push the most in the spring and summer are Kostiantynivka, Liman, Kramatorsk, and Sloviansk. The idea is probably to lay siege to the city, so it's interesting to see that this is happening. This maneuver is underway. Little to nothing is happening in the Sumy area, and they're probably trying to save resources in other areas that have become less active. Let's say that if we had to give an overview of the general Russian intention at the moment, this is the idea. To take Kostiantynivka from both flanks, reach Druzhivka, and above all, try to take this road to get to Sloviansk as quickly as possible. Why Sloviansk? Because instead of attacking Lyman head-on or trying to outflank it like they tried to do with that mechanized attack we talked about 10 minutes ago, if they manage to take Mykolaiivka and isolate Lyman by destroying the bridges, Lyman becomes impossible for the Ukrainians to hold. And they will inevitably have to fall back because they also want to outflank Lyman from the north. Because if they manage to reach this area, they cut off an important supply route for Sloviansk, because Sloviansk will have 1, 2, and 3 routes covered. This means that any Russian drone operators who manage to set up in this area will basically attack this supply route. So everything will be very centralized and under fire. This is at least the Russian objective for 2026 in the area, to try to capture Kramatov, Sloviansk, Kostiantynivka, and Lyman. It seems that all the forces, or at least they are prioritizing offensive efforts in these areas, so we'll see what they manage to do. For now, everything is moving very, very slowly. If we look at the progress that has been made during this period, we realize that it has been the worst period in almost 2 consecutive years of Russian offensives. Here you can see what the pace of the advance was in square kilometers in October 2023. Throughout 2024, they have remained on the offensive. They picked up again in May and June, as you can see, of 2025. Then it moves toward the winter months, November and December. March. It's also because of the weather, because of Starlink, because of Telegram, because of so many factors. But it's interesting to see that they weren't doing as badly as in March 2026, or basically December 2023. I mean, just to give you an idea, it had been since that period that they had achieved so little. This is interesting, and it's also interesting to mention, good job remembering it, the issue of the increasing recruitment incentives. But we hadn't seen such a small territorial advance since December 2023. We'll see what happens next. So as we can see, they are still generally gaining ground pretty much everywhere, but with a slowness we haven't seen in 2 years. So it's a combination of things. Even the frost that occurred certainly didn't help the Russian offensive activity. The Hulepole can also consider that the territorial gains were undermined by that Ukrainian counter-infiltration, which then managed to consolidate some ground and then managed to create other contested areas, and which slowly eroded a good 200 square kilometers of territory that was wrongly considered consolidated by the Russians. So these things also need to be kept under observation. I'll show you that some mappers, including one who is famously very generous toward the Russians, he too and others have started to acknowledge what has happened in the area, especially north of Giuliopola. And so, in short, they've acknowledged that, okay, it's not a Ukrainian counteroffensive, but still these counterattacks have retaken some villages. And inevitably, the contested area has moved a bit further back. Then they took another one, and again, the contested area moved a bit further back. So it's a kind of mini offensive carried out over months with small groups that gradually recaptured a whole series of villages. But it's hard to talk about an offensive because everything happened in small increments in a very gradual and slow way. But the final effect in the end was that they retook a total of 19 villages, if I remember correctly, and a bit of territory. And so in the end, the result is that the Russians lost some positions. Now we'll see, because they're still digging new ones south of Giuliopola. So let's also talk about the rest of the general situation. Let's say especially regarding the area of Ternuvate, which is a bit further out. The maps that mainly show us the bombing activities give us an idea of where the Russians are about to act. Do you remember that they went up along Kreshine, Trapokros, Mirno, Harad, and so on? Here, take a good look. In red are the bombings up to the end of 2025, in yellow, those of 2026. You can already tell where they're aiming. Look at the Udakna area, please. So you also keep track of these things to get a sense of what the activity is. These are Pokrovska. This was the Udakna area. They went up exactly along this bombing zone. So here it's really intense. Every dot is a glide bomb. That's no small thing. It's really a hell of a lot of activity. So we see the area where the Ukrainians managed slowly with small counterattacks to retake several villages. So they moved, as you can see, the contested area. And this is interesting because while the Russians are trying again with more infiltrations of their own to go west beyond Ternuvate, the Ukrainians are trying to get behind the Russian position at Kuliaipol. And this is interesting because if the Ukrainians manage to get there, around this area that is between Berezove and especially here, they cut the Russians off from this road, a road that, as you can see, from Velika Novosilka crosses everything. There's only that one. There are no others. Transversal roads, that is from east to west. This part goes from Velika Novosilka and goes down to Kuliaipole. The Ukrainians are slowly eroding this position from behind. That's what they're trying to do, especially in this area. Here, that is the area of Uspenivka. It's quite clear. You have the Russians pushing up towards Kuliaipol, no longer to the south, and you have the Ukrainians trying to cut it off. this salient to buy time and reinforce Ternopate. Meanwhile, the Russians, who have realized that further north of Kuliaipol there is a lot of resistance and many Ukrainian counterattacks, have started to move units. Where south of Kuliaipol they are trying to gain ground on the other side, because otherwise you have Kuliaipol on this flank and you end up with the Ukrainians on the other flank as well. You do. Obviously, in this war, it's extremely difficult to do things like that because both the Ukrainians and the Russians are really moving at a sluggish pace to deploy units. Here you can see it even better. The Russians are pushing towards Ternovate, and west of Kuliaipol, the Ukrainians are pushing towards Uspenivka. Thank you all. This is the attempt the Ukrainians are making. Everyone tries to play their own game, everyone. But both, despite the Ukrainians managed to take back 50-200 kilometri quadrati in this area little by little, but it still took them 2.5 months. And in 2.5 months, you don't pull off encirclements, you don't set traps, there are no traps. In this sense, however, you can clearly see how the area for the Russians is more exposed on this side, so we'll see what happens. So on one side, we have the Russians trying to push on the western flank of Kuliaipol to get behind Orekiv. Getting there is a chain reaction. The Russians want to cut the road that goes from Kuliaipol to Velika Novosilka, and the Russians also want to cut from Kuliaipol towards Orekiv. So everyone tries to pursue their own goals. In the area around Kamyanske, which is on the left between Orekiv and the Dnieper, lately there have been attacks and counterattacks from both sides, where the Russians managed to reach as far as Malokaterinivka, and now the Ukrainians are counterattacking towards Primorske. So how do we see this number of units, especially infantry? Are they holding the front or attacking the front in such small groups, or are they holding the ground with such small groups? They cause this pendulum effect, where one day there's a Russian incursion 10 kilometers forward, and another day it's a Ukrainian incursion. In fact, this is a Russian map, and it's the Russians in this case who are geolocating the Ukrainian unit in this area, which doesn't mean that the Ukrainians have taken it. It simply means they've infiltrated exactly like the Russians do. Notice that there's a contradiction in terms. Why is this map called Kremi Caprice? When it's the Russians infiltrating, you see the red dot. This is the Russian infiltration. That is this one. They already show it as taken. You see, there's no gray area. If the Russians infiltrate, everything is considered taken. If the Ukrainians, on the other hand, are reported as infiltrators inside the area that, according to this map, is under solid Russian control, it remains Russian-controlled territory. Well, remarkably, more serious maps like Polevulan's show a gray incursion zone. And the actual area of control is further back. If you check mine, it's exactly the same thing. It's nice to see this double standard at the moment. But I mean, if you apply a method and then it turns against you, can you stick the Ukrainian flag inside the territory that you declare as consolidated? I mean, it's ridiculous. But what can I say? We live with these things too. If someone has a method, they have to apply the method, period.
Comunque in ogni caso.
I'll show you an example of how we map Orsi's map. No, it's Crime Caprice. I don't know which map he follows, but if you use Crime Caprice, there's a ton of stuff. There you see a consolidated area, an area where you know who's fighting. And it's quite wide because it's impossible to determine. So no double standards for anyone. This is the method. He also points out that most maps show either only the Russian units or only the Ukrainian units. Ukrainian maps show only Russian units. Russian maps show only Ukrainian units. I think we're among the few who show all of them. Us and a few other maps. We show everything and with no delays in updating either side. We don't play favorites or cut anyone any slack. We don't have a horse in this race in that sense. So, gentlemen, apart from that, there isn't much news from the front. As you can see, however, there is still all the news about Russian movements. And also in which area they give us a hint. Probably April, May, much more likely May, they will start to take action. There are also movements by Azov. I also give you a lot of topics that I sometimes don't even bring up during the live stream. So as not to bore you though, inside you'll also find a lot of other sources that talk about other issues that I might not mention here, sharing live. Why are they a minority? But if someone is interested in seeing where Azov is moving, on which front or things like that, there are a lot of internal movements also regarding the Ukrainian units, because there are internal movements, because they probably also sense where the hardest blow will come. So they also expect to have to move their reserves into the area. I recommend you especially follow Unit Observer, who has always done an excellent job. We've never caught him saying anything false or making a mistake. Regarding the movement, note that the Azov is being sent to the sector. The Azov Corps is in the Pokrovsk sector, and the 33rd Mechanized is being sent more towards Siversk-Lyman. Because that's where the Russians are pushing the most. Some units are being withdrawn from Kupiansk because there hasn't been much activity there lately, while there is increasing activity north of Pokrovsk. Here is the 12th Azov Brigade and practically all the brigades that belong to the Azov Army Corps. The 14th Chervona Kalina Brigade, the 20th Lyubat Brigade, the 4th Rubizh, and the 1st Burevy Brigade. Basically, the entire Azov Army Corps is here, deployed around Rodinske, Dobropilia, and so on. And it's no coincidence that right now the Russians are concentrating a lot of units here. We'll see what happens. But gentlemen, this is the bulk of the activity. In the area, as I promised you, I've also included links to other mappers, even from the other side. Let's say Baha's pro-Russian, where they also talk about that kind of Ukrainian offensive. You know, one of them, his name is AMK Mapping. The other is called Suryak, who is one of those who had to backtrack since he had assigned territory to the Russians. Everyone says exactly, I show it on purpose to say that, as you can see, even unlike Tifo or Bahas, everyone admits that, in fact, even if it's not exactly a counter-offensive, it's still a series of Ukrainian counterattacks. In the end, slowly. AMK Mapping says it, about 288 square kilometers in this area, which is the area north of Kulepol, and Suryak Maps says 275. So, as you can see, do they call them offensives? In my opinion, that's wrong, because it's not an offensive, but rather a series of counterattacks. The blue dots basically represent the recaptured villages, the recaptured villages that were previously more or less under Russian control. Let's say there are several mappers as well, each with their own biases. They admit that slowly the Ukrainians are threatening Kulepole from behind. It's not an offensive, as I told you, because at such a slow pace and 5 kilometers per week, calling it an offensive is a bit much. Let's say it's more or less the same method used by the Russians on other fronts, so it's a very slow, ongoing process. That's why I always feel like laughing. When Pokrovsk fell, 2,000 Ukrainians were captured. A turtle that, if it had set out from Pokrovsk, if it were heading toward Kiev, would have arrived there during 2025. It can't trap people when the speed of capturing and consolidating territory is what it is. And I'm afraid that both sides will use drones even more remotely via satellite systems. Maybe the prophecy I made 2.5 years ago with Leonardo Lanzara, when I was asked, how do you see the wars of the future? I said, an avalanche of people inside warehouses, each with a joystick in hand and millions of drones. We're getting closer. The problem is whether both the Russians and the Ukrainians will have hundreds of thousands of drone operators, 100, 200,000. But who will take the ground? Who will secure it with all this stuff flying around? You've seen them by now, right? You've seen the videos. They go through windows into tunnels and so on. So even the infantry is at great risk. There's a real danger of just having casualties. Yes, but it's all inconclusive because no one can consolidate anything. No one takes anything. It only takes 10 infantrymen to retake a village, and then a swarm of drones comes, so this thing just keeps repeating. Here it becomes a Mexican standoff where all you do is count the number of drones flying, and those few infantrymen who risk their lives to try to occupy a village for a few hours before another wave of drones arrives. On the other hand, it's quite bleak as a strategic outlook for both sides. A protracted war, quite remote with hundreds of drone operators, and every now and then someone dies because someone has to take the ground. Maybe Zalugini was right when he said about 2.5 years ago that if there's no technological innovation, there's no way to break the status quo of this war. And I repeat, those who think that this war will be the model for future wars, which will be fought in exactly the same way, that's not the case. The China-America war would be fought mainly from an air and naval perspective. This one is particular because of both sides' inefficiencies. A well-prepared army with air and missile power, etc., would not reach this kind of stalemate. It's a peculiarity caused by the Russians' mistakes at the beginning, which squandered resources in the first year of the war. And so they had to mobilize, make do, etc., and the Ukrainians the same, who had to scramble to create an army in an emergency situation. If both sides were fully armed, which was what was expected from the Russians, go back and watch the live stream we did with Colonel Ostirpe. Regarding the misjudgments made by Europeans, Americans, and also Russians, where did they go wrong? Americans and Russians shared the same point of view. That is, they thought the Ukrainians would last only a few weeks. And so they themselves were not prepared for a long-term open war either. A stalemate that seems to exist in Iran even now, well, it's not a stalemate in Iran. I'll finish with this and then refer you to the next live session. It's not a stalemate from a tactical point of view. Israelis and Americans are definitely winning by a landslide from a strategic perspective. No, because as long as 10 drones and 5 missiles are flying over the Strait of Hormuz, the strategic objective of neutralizing Iran, the regime, or its military capability, nothing else matters. All the data, even the latest I saw just today, show that in the last week, the Iranians have managed to maintain a steady rate of about 20 to 30 missiles per day and about 80 to 100 drones. That number doesn't go down anymore. So they're probably doing shoot and scoot, meaning they go out, fire, and then return. And this is something that's sustainable in the long term. I read an American article where they say they've destroyed at least 30% of the launchers, production capacity, and depots. But they also state that there's another 30% they can't touch because it's too deep, and that they've also dispersed across the territory. The problem is when you give these percentages, 30%, but 30% of what? 30% of 1,000, 30% of 10,000, 30% of 20,000. Because if it's 30% of 1,000, okay, then there are 300 missiles left. But if it's 30% of 6,000 and they have 20 to 30 missiles a day, they can keep firing for another 9 months. Percentages should be provided, but also put into context. So, gentlemen, I thank you very much. I wish you a good weekend, and we'll see each other again either on Sunday or Tuesday when we'll do a live stream about artificial intelligence with Ivan Barbato. It's been a really tough, demanding, and exhausting month. We have covered so many topics, and I want to thank everyone who followed us because we reached record numbers. This month, the channel will reach almost 3 million views, so I thank everyone for their attention and see you soon. Good night.